So you've seen me looking neat. I can now take my jacket off because that's about as neat as I get. So yes, slightly tongue-in-cheek. Inhassoro is about where the East African rift system meets the sea, and that's where this field is. It really does not look anything like what Peter's been talking about. We're back to a fairly normal heat flow. We're back to a normal marine source rock. So let's go through that. Here's my forward-looking statements. We are listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and therefore you have to read this. I'm not going to make forward-looking statements. I'm going to talk about where the source probably came from rather than where it's going to. So. Here's Sasol. It's South Africa's largest publicly listed company. Everything's in rand. If you want to do the division, it's about 14 rand a pound. We are the world's largest producer of synthetic fuels. That's gas to liquids either from coal or from methane. A lot of that methane we currently get out of Mozambique. We have more than 60 years experience in doing that. The Fischer-Tropsch system is a German system from the 1920s, and it was developed in the days when South Africa couldn't buy its oil anywhere else. It does mean we have a pretty strong IP portfolio behind how we develop that system. And we're really a chemicals company, and an oil company is a small piece of that. We have a very wide range, as you can see there. The pointer is pretty dying, but that's shale gas in Canada. We're building a vast GTL plant here in Louisiana. It stretches to exploration of Papua New Guinea. Lots of stuff in Southern Africa, and I'm going to talk about that blue blob there, which is Mozambique. In Mozambique, we produce gas, about 300 million cubic feet a day, most of which heads for South Africa. We get condensate out of that gas. It varies condensate gas ratio from about 1 in our driest field up to about 15 in our wetter gas fields. And more recently, we've started producing oil. There's a central processing facility. There's a pipeline which gets the gas out. We've started building a power plant. South Africa is very hungry for electricity. So anybody who can supply electricity is gratefully received. We're building a power plant in Mozambique, but to supply electricity to South Africa. Obviously, a lot of what we do heads for South Africa, but more recently, the last 18 months, we've signed 4 different contracts with gas developments inside Mozambique. Mozambique had a very long and miserable civil war out of which they've come. The government is very good at helping us and helping to push a diversification of what is going on there. So, I suppose the first thing to say is Mozambique is really big. That's something 2,600, 2,700 kilometers of coastline. It's about the length of Western Europe. So it is a really big place. And that's important because what Mike was talking about earlier up here in the Rovuma-Rufiji area, and the well that Peter was talking about drilling is all going on, that's just off here. The Rovuma sits up there, and then into Nazi Bay and going north is up there. That is an awfully long way from anywhere. Not to mention that because of the Civil War and because of the fact that Mozambique is very flat, there's very little infrastructure. The rivers come through every year and flood province after province of Mozambique. The Portuguese got the floodplain. The British took all the mountains inland as far as one can see. And so the floods come through. The Zambezi comes through about here, and that really cuts the country in two. There is a northern area, less developed, a southern area going from Beira south, better developed, and Maputo, the capital, sits in the south. When we look at Sasol's acreage, I'm in London to farm out Safala, which is one of our offshore blocks. So I've taken the opportunity to talk about the bigger picture because Sasol doesn't often talk very much. So I'm looking at this northernmost block. There's the port of Beira sitting there. Beira acts as the sort of port and a sort of infrastructure hub which allows imports all the way up into Zimbabwe, Malawi. In fact, it goes all the way up into the Katanga province of the DRC. There's pipelines and railway lines come into Beira. Further south, we have production coming out of fields here at Pandey and Tumane, and I'm going to talk about the Inhassoro oil field, which sits just shoreward of the Tumane gas field. We also have a number of other exploration areas. Light blue stands for areas we're currently producing. Orange are areas under appraisal, and the darker blue is exploration zones. So let's look at a bit at the structure and talk a bit more about what we think might be going on. I'm afraid Mike feels he's got a really good handle on what is going on geochemically in his source rock. I'm going to stay at the fairly clueless stage. I will tell you what we know, but there's also a whole bunch of known unknowns, as Mr. Onsfield would say. Oops, sorry, wrong button. Let's talk. Here is the Svala block. Here's Beira. Here's the two big producing fields at Pandey and Tamane. And here is Inhassoro just sitting to the shoreward. This was discovered back in the 1950s by Gulf. There was a huge blowout by the Russians in the 1960s when they drilled through the Pandey field. They managed to flare a TCF of gas in 1 year. I think you could probably have seen this from Mars, let alone seeing it from the moon. It was such a big flare. These two fields are now hooked up, and they feed via this 865-kilometer pipeline to our heartland, which sits just to the south of Johannesburg, where the Sasolburg and Secunda plants have been converted to at least partially run off this gas from Mozambique. Tamane, the first one came on shore in 2004. Pandey, the one to the north, a little bit drier gas. This has got a CGR of about 7 here at Tamane. Pandey is about 1. It's fairly dry. And then there's also some other discoveries. We have about 8 other gas discoveries which aren't shown on that map, which range in CGR up to about 15. Inhassoro is the one I'll talk about in a second. And we declared that commercial about 6 weeks ago, after a long history. And you think, why is it taking you so long to get there? Well, there are some actually pretty good reasons. Oh, actually, before I leave that one, I just want to mention this grey area. This is pretty much where the East African Rift finally meets the sea. To the north sits Lake Nyasa, or Lake Malawi, depending on what you want to call it. And then it comes down through what is the Zambezi Graben, and then this is the Chasenga Graben, which isn't a tertiary graben at all. This is part of the extension of the Mozambique basin system. Onshore, we see that oriented in a sort of northwest-southeast direction, but then when you get round to the coast, it's pretty much in a north-south direction, and that's probably part of where it's tying up with what is going to, in the future, become the East African rift system. At the time this was spreading, it was not part, but this is the last gasp of the East African rift system. So when I say that Inhassoro is the southernmost field in there, it is tongue-in-cheek. It is not an East African rift basin oil field, but it is right where it meets the sea, and that may not be a coincidence. Okay, let's look at the field itself. This was originally found, like so much of the area, the stuff in the area was found by Gulf in 1965 with Inhassoro 1. It's a gas well. Gas, as you can imagine, onshore in Mozambique in the 1960s, less valuable than water. It's a completely useless resource. We took over in 2003. This is part of us coming in. The Civil War had ended. There was all this gas that had been found. It was sitting there in southern Mozambique. And as part of that, we started laying the pipeline, brought Tamane on in 2004. We also started exploring for ourselves. And in 2003, we drilled, so Inhassoro 1 sits there in the gas cap, which is marked pretty much in the red outline as the gas cap. Then Inhassoro 4 is drilled a little bit down dip, as one does, stepping out. It has gas in the upper layer, but it also went through a lower layer of sands. These, I'll talk a bit more about the chronostrat in a few slides' time, but suffice to say there are a number of stack sandstones in the Gruja, the upper Cretaceous sandstone layer that we are in. This is the map of the G6. There's a G7, G8, G9, and it goes all the way down to about 12A in the Gruja. And each one of these is a coarsening upward sequence. And so you have coarsening upward sand, then shale, then another sand comes in below that. So this is the G6 map. They actually drilled through and had oil in the G10 in I4, which is the lower leg. And then finally, this is I6 here, which finally clips the oil leg of the upper sand of the G6 layer, which is the one mapped here. I say it's an oil leg. Actually, it's more like a condensate leg. Not condensate in the sense that it's condensing out of the gas as we produce it. It certainly doesn't do that. It's probably a condensate that has condensed inside the reservoir. Well, not that. The reservoir depth isn't particularly deep here. And the gas in the system is current. In that sense, we're very like what Peter was talking about. What we see at the moment is probably peak migration in this basin. So there's probably gas coming through here. It's dropping condensate out in the reservoir. So you have about 750 BCF of gas sitting above and several hundred million barrels of oil below. However, I4 goes into a deeper layer, goes into the G10 layer of the Gruja, and that's entirely oil, and that is a proper oil rather than a condensate. It's a very, very light oil, but it is a real oil in its own right. So, having made a discovery in 2003 and discovered the upper oil leg in 2007, it makes you wonder why we didn't get after this thing. Well, it's a very odd reservoir, to put it mildly. First of all, except for two of our gas discoveries, almost all our discoveries have a strong stratigraphically trapped basis. You can see here, this is the matte pinch out of the sand on this side, and then the other side, it is a dip closed down towards the sea. So first of all, it's hard to map because of the nature of the stratigraphic pinch out. Secondly, the sands themselves are very odd, and by odd I mean they have some strange mineralogy. There is siderite in there, there's glauconite in there, and worst of all, there's a whole bunch of mixed layer clays stuck in amongst the sands, and those mixed layer clays bind a whole bunch of water. So porosity gets up to about 30%, but about half of our porosity is actually bound water. And so when you do pressure through Inhassoro, for instance, you get an oil gradient, very nice oil gradient, through what we now know to be an oil reservoir. And so water gradient, oil production. We actually see some of that in our gas fields too, where you're getting a perfectly good water gradient, but it produces gas very nicely. And we have to say we're fairly confused. But in order to try and put our minds to rest, back in 2011, we decided we'd go into I9, which is a well-drilled foot up here. We'd do a sidetrack, and then we would do a short horizontal through the oil leg, put the oil leg on production, and once and for all discover whether this thing works for us. And there are a number of memos kicking around, now famous, from various people saying you're going to produce nothing but water. Or if you do produce oil, it's all going to have watered out within a month. It's now, the EWT went on for 1 year. I think we've just finished shutting it in end of last month. We finally shut our EWT in. It flows about 1,000 barrels a day, day in, day out. There's no water production. There's no pressure drop in a reservoir that, as I said on the logs, looks wet. So we probably answered our question. We now know that this is a fairly substantial field, that it will flow very beautifully. We just have to now figure out exactly how to develop it. The good news is the coastline is here. So we're not 1,000 kilometers inland. We're actually pretty much on the coast. The bad news is that this whole area offshore is a marine park. But the marine park ends about here. So we suppose if we just go a little bit to the north, we can get round the north end of the marine park. Let's look a little bit at the stratigraphy of the basin, because that's what I used to be before I became a commercial manager. I was a stratigrapher. So I feel comfortable talking about this. This is approximately from the west across to the east. It's a rift basin. It's not dissimilar to the stratigraphy that Mike described earlier. It's classic East African rifting margin. It starts here in the late Jurassic, goes through the Cretaceous, and in the Tertiary we get a number of deltas coming through. What is interesting about the Mozambique Basin is the Mozambique Basin is caused by a river that is now an awful lot smaller, which is the Limpopo. To the north, we have the Zambezi, which is a river which is probably about the same size that now as it has been in the past, and it's putting a lot of tertiary sediment into the basin. And of course, then you go further north, you get the Rovuma and the Rufiji, which are putting, again, large amounts of sediment into the basin. The Limpopo to the south fills the Mozambique Basin, or at least the onshore part of it, but is now putting a lot less sediment into the offshore. So to the west, in the onshore, you get these red beds, then you come through fairly sandy pieces, and then towards the marine side, you get shales. I would love to say that we know what the source rock is. We don't. Let's just put it there. The work we've done on the oil and condensate that we have so far says that it's not a Karoo source, or the gas for that matter. Our hydrocarbons are not coming from the Karoo, they're coming from somewhere between the Upper Jurassic and Lower Cretaceous. So it's these shales you see marked on here, this one, or that one, or this one, or here, that is our source rock. Potentially there's more than one source rock currently active. We do see a complete range from quite dry gas at Panday, right through to a light oil at Inhassoro, and so potentially we're getting interacting source rocks going on. If you wanted my guess, you may have source coming here from the Lupata shale, and also here from the Domo shale. But you pay your money and you take your choice. What we can say is it's not tertiary, it's not Permo-Triassic. You can see that from the signatures and the geochemistry. Target-wise, we look at two targets. One is this lower Garuja section here. These are these stacked coarsening upward sequences, shore, face sands, minor deltaics. We number them from the first sand we see, we call it G6, and then we number it down, G7, G8, G9, and so forth. It's really interesting. However, and then people say, oh, you've got a G6 sand here producing, and you've got a G6 sand down there producing. They must be linked. Well, no. It's just the first sand you encounter as you drill through. G6 in one place is not a G6 in another. These sands do have a strong stratigraphically closing component. They may be the same pulses, but certainly when we map it going east to west, the G6 that you see in the onshore, you can see that by the time it gets further offshore, it's actually more like the G11 or G12. So we have to have a numbering system. We do it. Please don't try and correlate them across. It's a recipe for failure. Below that, we have this Domo sandstone that is present and then below that, there's a Sina sandstone which sits down here. So that we have a number of potential reservoirs. Certainly gas has been produced and a little bit of oil out of this Domo sandstone, and the Garuja is our main producing environment to date. As you get further off, we do get this Zambezi Delta complex. A number of wells have been drilled into it, none of them successful so far. My personal guess for the Zambezi is that the source rock here is over mature by the time you get to the Zambezi, and because of this shale package sitting in here, any generation here is being pushed up to the west towards the onshore and is not getting through to the overlying tertiary sands within the Zambezi. Here's a stratigraphic column. I just want to put that on to show the reservoir sections in here and the potential source rock over on the right-hand side. Again, nothing from the Karoo, nothing from down here in the Permo-Triassic that we can see. Rifting starts here with the Lupata, which varies from red beds all the way to shales, depending on where it is. Then through the Sina, Domo, and into the Garuja. This whole pile is a series of stacked sands and shales. As Peter said, you don't actually need that much shale to act as a seal here. You also, as we have learned to our own cost, going around trying to chase four-way dip-closed plays is probably not the right thing to be doing. All of our fields have got a strong stratigraphic component. So you're really looking for, it's better to drill a nose probably than it is to drill to desperately hunt for a four-way dip-closed structure. Panday, Inhassoro, Buzi, Tamane all produce out of the Garuja. The Nemo, one well in the offshore, produced out of the Domo sandstone. And then there are gas shows lower down out of the Sena sandstone in a lot of these other wells. Sourcing, well, it's either the Domo shale here, or it's the Lapata shale, which isn't actually shown on here, but it's the shorewood facies variation from the red beds in the onshore. So we take a cross-section across, just to show how this works in a structural sense. It's taken from A down out here, across the Zambezi Delta to the Beira High. So here we have these fairly bald systems in the center. This is taken from a BP report for ENH in the year 2000. I like the way it shows the structure, which is why I've left it on there. Actually, we now know from our seismic that these onshore grabens have a much deeper sediment pile than is shown on this map. And to be fair to the person from BP who drew it, he did put question marks there. We know this Jurassic sequence in these basins is an awful lot more than they then thought when they drew this back in 2000. So we have these internal basins. You can see those there, the inner graben system. We can see, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Then we come across the Pandey Tamane Inhassoro area here, which I suppose is shown here, and these shown in this area. Then comes the Chasenga Graben, which is this last gasp of the East African rift basins. I suppose if you want the East African rift, there it is. It's the lower Zambezi Graben. But really the grabens below Urema and the Chasenga are actually much more late Jurassic, early Cretaceous. They're not actually acting as big tertiary rifts at the moment. You can see there is tertiary loading going on top, but there's not a huge pile of tertiary sediment being piled on top of the Chasenga at this current time. Here is a Chasenga. This is what we believe is probably our source area, source kitchen for Pandey, Tamane, Buzi, Inhassoro, and any prospects, the Nemo gas that sits on this side, and any other prospects on the other side of the Graben. Here is the Nemo well on the far side of the Graben. This produced out of the Domo sandstone in this area. And then we go into the deep Zambezi, and people have drilled through this big tertiary pile, so far with no success. That doesn't mean the success isn't there, but again, it comes back to this problem of looking for four-way dip-closed plays, and when really it isn't, that isn't what you should be looking for. And then you come up onto the Beira High as you go into the far offshore. Look at a couple of lines. These are taken from, this is the, if I show the Safala block again, things dying. It sits here on the far side of the Chasenga Graben. It's the area we're going to drill next year. So there's a nice 3D shot last year across it. And again, Nemo 1 was a well drilled by Gulf back in 1969. They drilled it, because the Russians had this fantastic blowout earlier in the decade, they drilled this thing 10 pounds overweight as they drilled through it. This reservoir, it doesn't like 10 pounds overweight. It does have these mixed layer clays, it has other sorts of mineralogy. It has, as I said, porosities up to 30% in places, but it doesn't, nobody likes 10 pounds overweight. And they managed to flow small amounts of gas out of it and recovered some oil out of the reservoir with it. And so the plan is to go back and hopefully not abuse our reservoir quite as badly as that and see if we can actually get this thing to flow. And in many ways it's the mirror image to Inhassoro and Tamane on the other side of the Chasenga Graben. There are also prospects up here at the Geruja level, which is somewhat higher up. It has nice to have a 3D, and we don't get 3D in the onshore. It has a really nice mappable DHI across the Nemo prospect and across some leads such as Nemo West. So, but we already knew that it was gas in there because, of course, the gas flowed for Gulf back in '69. Our question is there an oil leg, like in Inhassoro, and can we get this reservoir to flow? Those are our two big questions. And after we do that one, which is next year, that's the drilling program is going to be checking the far side of the Chasenga Graben in the offshore to see if we can chase it there. If we look here, here is, again, the Pande field, the Tamane field, and Inhassoro sitting here virtually on the beach. Block A, area A, sits to the inside. We're currently debushing and demining. As I said, they had a miserable civil war, and the Renamo guerrillas tended to wander around randomly, leaving landmines. It wasn't even putting minefields up, they just wandered along some path and left a mine somewhere. And even now, 20 years later, we're cleaning, still finding the occasional landmine along some trail in the bush. So all the work we do has to be a matter of demining and debushing. We've done most of that, and we're now shooting seismic across here. Seismic looks pretty good. You can see some of these deeper basins here and these inner graben systems. And we're going to be looking for Gruja plays up there. But the problem, of course, with the Gruja plays, we've talked about from Pande and Tamane, is that they tend to have a strong stratigraphic component. These are shore-face sands building out into the reservoir, so into the basin, and therefore, you may be wrong if you're hunting strongly for a four-way dip closed structure. Fortunately, the deeper sandstone at the Domo is more laterally continuous, and if we can find a nice four-way dip closed piece at the Domo, then we'll probably gratefully receive it and drill that. So that's our plan for the year after next. Okay, I think I've said everything I need to say about Inhassoro. I will take any questions you have.
Thank you, Steve. Time for one or two questions, if you